This is the Q&A podcast, and I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for joining us. Our guest this week is author Christopher Scalia. He's written a book entitled 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but Probably Haven't Read, and our conversation with him begins shortly. Well, according to the late President Calvin Coolidge, conservatives must perpetuate great works of art. And critic and opinion writer Christopher Scalia, son of the late Justice Antonin Scalia, agrees. In his new book, he recommends 13 novels with conservative themes that he says aren't widely known. The book is entitled 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love But Probably Haven't Read, and the former English professor discusses books by Walter Scott, George Eliot, P.D. James, Zora Neale Hurston, and others. The author is Christopher Scalia, and our conversation with him begins now. Christopher Scalia is the author of this book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love But Probably Haven't Read. Mr. Scalia, we're going to start by listing the 13 books.
Great.
Samuel Johnson, Rasselas; Frances Burney, Evelina; Walter Scott, Waverley; Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Blithedale Romance; George Eliot, Daniel Deronda; Willa Cather, My Antonia; Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God; Evelyn Waugh, Scoop; Muriel Sparks, The Girls of Slender Means; V.S. Naipaul, A Bend in the River; P.D. James, The Children of Men; Leif Enger, Peace Like a River; and Christopher Baha, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. How'd you come up with this list?
Well, years of study. When I was brainstorming this book, I had an idea of novels that I had long thought conservatives should read, that they were ignoring, especially the fiction of Walter Scott, who at one point everybody had read, but had kind of fallen off the radar. And I just thought it was important because when you talk to conservatives about fiction, they tend to discuss the same handful of novels, like The Lord of the Rings or Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, something by George Orwell, usually 1984, Brave New World, things like that. And obviously C.S. Lewis, Ayn Rand. And for the most part, I think those are great books. And I don't want to discourage people from reading those. But my sense was that conservatives were kind of unaware of the literary tradition available to them. And I wanted to kind of open up the conversation a little bit or expand the conservative bookshelf. Now, there were a number of criteria that I applied to these books, and the first one was that they are great. So the title is Conservatives Will Love These Novels, but I really do think anybody will love these novels because they are, they don't proselytize. I think the conservatism is fairly clear in most of them, but they're still not preachy. And they're just great works of literature. The writing is exceptional. The characters are memorable. The events are exciting. Things you want from fiction. But conservatives will love them because they address themes and ideas and principles that conservatives hold especially dear or find especially interesting.
Now, you said years of research. Where were you doing this research?
I had been a college professor, so PhD program, and then when I was a professor, I encountered many of these books. My focus was 18th century and early 19th century British literature, so I already had a lot of ideas from there, but I knew that I couldn't just focus on that area. Not enough people would care about the book then. So I took a couple of years to write the book, and in that period, I read a lot of novels I had been meaning to get to for a while. When I talk to people about this book, they usually say they've read only a few of the novels, and they tend to say that a little bit sheepishly. And that makes me feel bad because I hadn't read all of these novels when I started this project. I had read just over half of them, I think. So the point is to get people to read more widely and to discover these books and not to scold them into thinking that they had that they had their heads buried in the sand all this time. But it was a difficult process because I had to limit it. The original idea was 10 novels, but that was just too tough. So I copped out and went to 13, lucky number 13 after all. And even then, I had to leave out a lot of novels I like recommending.
Where did the interest in 18th and 19th century British literature come from?
I don't know. I think a lot of it was the professors I had in college just kind of roped me in. It was my first semester in college. I was taking a British literature survey course, and it was romantic poetry is what just kind of roped me in. And then from there, I never really, I read a lot more apart from that, but that's still the literature that excites me the most and I have the most fun talking about. In graduate school, I expanded that a little bit and read a lot more Scottish literature in particular, kind of developed a subspecialty there. And then when I became a college professor, I taught at a small liberal arts college, which meant I had to teach a lot of courses outside of my specialty areas. So that was a great way to kind of read more widely and flex different literary muscles, if you will.
So people who are watching this or listening to this are saying to themselves, man, that's a familiar last name. Law never interested you?
It interested me, but my father was on the Supreme Court by the time I was looking into careers, and I had two brothers who were already well into legal careers, and I'm a little bit of a contrarian. That runs in my family's nature, and that just I wanted to make life a little bit more difficult for myself. So it's funny that there's a lot of overlap between the study of literature and study of the law. My father, Antonin Scalia's own father, taught Romance languages at Brooklyn College, so there was already a PhD in the family, and I kind of followed his father's path instead of his path. But arguing about writing, attending to the details of the text, things like that, those are definitely areas of overlap between the profession I chose and what my father did.
Now, these 13 novelists that you picked are not necessarily conservatives, correct?
Correct. I'm not sure how many of them would actually describe themselves as conservatives. There are a couple who certainly would. Walter Scott, author of Waverley, published in 1814, would have called himself a conservative or a Tory. And Zora Neale Hurston certainly considered herself a conservative, which I think surprises people, and Evelyn Waugh as well. But others, I think, would probably bristle at this suggestion. And that's one of the reasons I don't call the title isn't conservative novels. I think that oversimplifies the case a little bit. I think that great literature is open to multiple, not infinite, but multiple interpretations and readings. And so I offer what I think are reasonable conservative readings of all of these novels. But I think that there are alternate readings that progressives could offer. That would be reasonable. I wouldn't necessarily agree with them. Their Eyes Were Watching God, Hurston's novel, is probably the best example. That was published in the 1930s, and it was widely panned by some prominent critics of the Harlem Renaissance, because basically they said that this was a novel full of black characters that white people would like. And they didn't call her an Uncle Tom, but that would probably how that novel would have been described now. But she was deeply conservative. She hated communism. She was a great American patriot. The New York Times columnist John McWhorter likes to joke that today she would be as comfortable on PBS as on Fox News, because she had this obvious literary and cultural interest, but was also very conservative. When she died, she was obscure. People weren't reading her work. But in the late 70s, the great black novelist Alice Walker revived her career, brought her back to the forefront. And since the late 70s, she's enjoyed quite a bit of attention. At the moment, or at least the last I checked, she is the American female novelist most often assigned in high school and college. And the only woman whose fiction is assigned more often is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That was not the case when I was in school, probably not the case when you were in school, but that's how it is now. So some readers might see my table of contents, see that I include her, and think, well, everybody's read this, but it's kind of a relatively recent phenomenon. And the people who do read her, I think, are not aware of her conservatism and of the conservative ideas conveyed in this book.
Well, what were some of the themes in Their Eyes Were Watching God that you found?
I think the most interesting one to me is the message of self-reliance, both within the Black community, but just for individuals as well. Hurston does not ignore Jim Crow and racism. She's very aware of that, but she also, her focus is on the black characters and how they lift themselves up. One of the important settings of the novel is an all-Black community called Eatonville. She was born in a similar town, and the leader of that town, the main character, Janie Crawford, marries a man who is the mayor of that town. He is not a perfect person at all. He's deeply flawed, but he manages to do great things with that community by encouraging people to build and recognize what they can do. At the same time, he's the mayor, but he's not a model mayor. There are hints of corruption there. So that's why I say there are multiple interpretations here. He's a complex character, but this Black community is able to sustain this life on their own and have great success there. And along those same lines, there's a really interesting scene where a character in another community where Janie Crawford moves towards the end of the novel. She moves to the Everglades. She has a conversation with a neighbor. This neighbor is a light-skinned Black woman, as is Janie Crawford, and she is the biggest bigot in the novel. She looks down on all of the darker-skinned Black people in her community and says very racist things about them. And then during one of their conversations, this character, Mrs. Turner, starts explaining how bad Booker T. Washington was. And Booker T. Washington was just a Black man for white people. He did nothing to help Black people. Janie Crawford doesn't really push back very much. All she says is, well, I always thought he was a great man. And Mrs. Turner goes on to explain, actually, Booker T. Washington was terrible. And so it doesn't proselytize, but it raises the question of, if Mrs. Turner, who's clearly a despicable character, doesn't like Booker T. Washington, then maybe he was all right. Maybe there's something about his ideas. And so outside of this novel, Hurston was much more explicit about praising the ideas of Booker T. Washington, and particularly his messages of self-reliance and education. And the novel, she does not go into that same detail in the novel, but kind of plants hints there along the way in that scene.
Mr. Scalia, in your book, you write, are you asked the question, what can I get out of fiction that I can't get out of a book about things that really happened or are really happening? What can you get out of fiction?
I think the biggest argument for fiction is the one where people are embarrassed to make, which is beauty. Great fiction, and I'm focusing on literary fiction here, is beautiful. It has just remarkable writing that makes you reread it, not out of confusion, but out of a sense of wonder and just joy at encountering the incredible writing. I think there are a number of great examples of that throughout my book, but not my own writing, of course. But my favorite example is in My Antonia by Willa Cather, the great 1918 novel about Nebraskan pioneers. And her description of the landscape, that part of the country, is mesmerizing. And that's the kind of writing you most frequently, I wouldn't say only, but most frequently encounter in literary fiction. But along the way, you encounter great wisdom in fiction. Wisdom as told through characters and story. So the wisdom is presented in arguably more memorable and more humanizing way. So I think those are important components, important arguments for why we should engage with fiction. And along the lines of the wisdom argument, people frequently make the case for great fiction as a powerful tool in developing our sympathetic imagination. And people across the political spectrum make this case. Most recently, I think President Barack Obama made this case while he was still president. He argued that one of the most important things he got, most important lessons he learned about democratic citizenship, he got through novels, and which was understanding the ways different people think, and recognizing shades of gray in important conversations and political debates and ideas. And that doesn't mean, that idea of sympathy doesn't mean that you abandon all principles when you encounter thoughtful people you disagree with, thoughtful characters you disagree with in a novel, but you come to a more complex, more sophisticated understanding of how other people think.
With My Antonia, Willa Cather, feminist, presumably lesbian, not necessarily characteristics of a typical conservative.
Correct. I think that the thing with Cather is conservatives. I think everybody likes her. Conservatives will like My Antonia in particular because it is a great expression of what we would call the American dream. Its two central characters are the narrator, a man named Jim Burden, and the title character, Antonia. Jim Burden is born in Virginia. He's orphaned at a young age and moves out to Nebraska and has a more comfortable life than Antonia does, but is by no means an easy life. Antonia's family comes from Bohemia, part of what's now the Czech Republic, and her family has a much more difficult time. I won't give too much away, but not everybody makes it. And Antonia herself encounters prejudice, has a child out of wedlock, and really seems to be struggling in the United States early on. But through resilience and hard work, she comes, and I should say faith, she comes out of that tough experience, raises a very large family, marries, after marrying another immigrant from Bohemia, and has a very productive, if domestic, life. And I think that's one of the remarkable things about this novel. As you suggested, Cather herself never married. She didn't have any children. She was from a family of 7 herself, so she came from a big family, but she did not have a big family. But My Antonia has, towards the end of the novel, a remarkable description of a large family, a happy large family. And that's pretty rare in fiction. I come from a large family myself. I was kind of delighted to see how Cather depicts Antonia's enormous brood, these very rambunctious group of children with individual characteristics who love their parents. Parents love them back. It's an affectionate and hardworking household. So that, I think, that's one reason conservatives will love the novel. But it has to be said that Cather doesn't suggest that this is the only way for women to find, immigrant women to find success and happiness in the United States. A couple of Antonia's fellow immigrant friends who are women set off and have very successful careers without families. And then Jim Burden himself, he does not have a happy marriage, but he has a remarkable career. He's a very successful lawyer for the railroads and helping expand the United States, develop the United States. And Cather makes clear that he has that success because he loves the country. He develops the landscape successfully because he loves the landscape. It's kind of implied he knows what it's capable of and kind of what it can bear and what it can produce.
Very much achieving the American dream.
Very much achieving the American dream. Neither of them have perfect lives, and neither of them accomplish these things easily, but they accomplish them. Cather's fascinating because a professor I quote here, Bradley Berzer, calls her the most American of great American novelists. And I think that's a remarkable statement, in part because of the celebration of the American dream, or what hard work can lead to in the United States, but also because she really focused on the United States. Later novelists, the Lost Generation that followed Cather, like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, just to name a couple, great American novelists, obviously, but they set so much of their work outside of the United States, especially Hemingway, in a way that Cather didn't.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. On your list, you have 7 men, 6 women, 2 non-white Euro-Americans.
Mm-hmm.
The other American on this list, Nathaniel Hawthorne,
Mm-hmm.
are those the 3 Americans? Cather, Hurston, and Hawthorne?
I have Enger, Beha, And yeah, you mentioned Hurston. Yeah.
Right. So Nathaniel Hawthorne, not necessarily well known for the Blithedale Romance, which came out in 1852, is he?
Correct. Yeah, that it's not his best known novel, and that is the case with a lot of these novels. That readers may recognize the authors, but not necessarily these particular novels. I should say, anybody watching will wonder why I haven't included any Russians in particular here. I focus on English language originals just to make my life a little bit easier. No, Hawthorne obviously is best known for his short stories and then The Scarlet Letter. The Blithedale Romance is a remarkable novel because it's called a romance, and Hawthorne saw himself as writing romances, not less so realistic fiction. Meaning, so there are weird moments of surreal moments in this novel. I focus on the primary plot here, which is about an aspiring poet named Miles Coverdale, who sets out to help establish an agrarian commune, and it's basically a socialist commune.
It's very utopian.
It's very utopian, and the novel is a great big warning against utopian designs. It is not against the idea of progress, but Hawthorne is warning against the idea that you can remake human nature. And Coverdale and his fellow agrarian members of the commune quickly realize that their abstract theory is no match for experience. Just one example, a fairly funny example, is that Coverdale thinks that by joining this commune, he'll have tons of time to write. He'll just go out, he'll farm during the day, and then he'll have all night to himself. But what he doesn't realize is A, how hard farming is and how tired, worn out he is, and B, he's too worn out to actually write when the day is over. So he's frustrated by that experience. But then also elements of human nature come in and really kind of frustrate the ideals of the commune. There are relationship conflicts are kind of the primary source of tension throughout the novel. So in this chapter, I quote William F. Buckley's catchy phrase, "Don't immanentize the eschaton," which is a jokey way of saying, don't try to make paradise on earth. And a number of these novels kind of hint at a similar point. Human nature is constant. That doesn't mean change is not possible or that progress is possible. Both things are possible, but incremental change, incremental progress is the way to achieve progress in line with kind of recognizing the limits and promises of human nature.
And Christopher Scalia, this was based on real life
Yes.
Experiences for Nathaniel Hawthorne, correct?
About 10 years before the publication of this novel, he had participated in a commune called Brook Farm just outside of Boston in Massachusetts, and did not love it. He has a preface to this novel in which he says that it's not based on real experience, and I think most people kind of take him half seriously there. This is obviously a fictionalized account, but there are some obvious similarities between, for example, one of the main female characters in this book, a woman named Zenobia, has obvious parallels to an important figure at Brook Farm, Margaret Fuller.
Where did you teach English literature?
I taught at a small public liberal arts college in Wise County, Virginia, which is the very southwest tip of Virginia. It's called the University of Virginia's College at Wise. It's UVA's branch campus. I had about 2,000 students there then, and I think still.
Why did you choose to go there?
Well, the job market, it was not great, and it was one of a couple of schools offering a position in my field, and I was excited to take the position because I grew up in Virginia. I went to grad school in Wisconsin, spent 8 years in Wisconsin or outside of Virginia. I was excited to get back to Virginia, albeit in a very different part of Virginia. And I was excited, very excited to be a college professor.
You were raised in Northern Virginia, which is Washington, D.C.,
Yes.
essentially. Wise County is a good 8 hours.
It's a good 8 hours.
From where we are here. What was life like down there? We're talking Tennessee, Kentucky borders,
Yes.
correct?
Correct. When I grew up in Northern Virginia, I did not know about this part of Virginia, and I think a lot of people in Northern Virginia think the state more or less ends at Roanoke, but there's a big part of the state beyond that. It's a very different part of the state, same state, but worlds apart in a lot of ways. A lot more poverty. It used to be it used to thrive on the coal industry, and since coal has been in decline. There's much more poverty there. But it's beautiful, and the mountains are beautiful there. The climate is a little bit more temperate in the mountains than it is in the DC swamp. And the people were wonderful. I really enjoyed my time there.
Mr. Scalia, did you find that the students shared the same experiences that you had known in your life?
The biggest challenge for me was that a lot of students were first-generation college students who really only knew Southwest Virginia. And that was very different from my own upbringing and my way of life. And that was true of so many of the professors there. And so I had to acclimate and kind of understand how to engage with these students, to understand what they expected from college, what they knew about college going in. So there, I don't think there was an enormous cultural obstacle between me and the students, anything like that. But it was, they had very different experiences than I had growing up.
What books resonated with them in class?
Well, it's funny. I taught Waverly, and I taught Waverly pretty often, and I found that some students loved Waverly because that's a Scots-Irish part of the country, and they loved the Scottish backstory there. I had one student whose ancestors had fought in the Jacobite uprising, which is the topic of Waverly, before emigrating to the United States. So there are connections like that there. They also loved, not necessarily the novels I teach here, though they did really like Evelina, because everybody loves Jane Austen, and Evelina was Frances Burney's novel. Burney was herself a big influence on Austen. People love novels of manners, novels that poke fun at very rude people, people who don't understand social norms. That's still happening today, and that's why Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm are still popular shows. So my students liked Evelina as well, but they also loved the poetry, especially I mentioned the natural beauty of that part of the country. And so much of great romantic poetry deals with theories of the sublime and the beautiful, why we react to certain landscapes, why we react to certain settings and descriptions as we do. And I think the Romantics were obsessed with mountains and rural settings, and a lot of my students kind of connected with those poems pretty strongly.
So when Frances Burney wrote Evelina in, what year was that, 1798?
1779, I think.
1779. She published it anonymously, correct?
Yeah, that was pretty common. Walter Scott, for example, published Waverly anonymously. Samuel Johnson published Rasselas anonymously, but people had different reasons for doing that. And for Burney, she published anonymously because she was a young woman. She was very young, and she, in part, feared her father's disapproval. She wrote much of the novel in secret, but word spread about who had written it, and she eventually wrote other novels that can't remember if she published the other novels anonymously, but even when identities were discovered, people would still publish anonymously, just kind of keep up to maintain the authorial fiction and intrigue.
Who was Walter Scott, and why was he so well known in his age?
Walter Scott was a great Scottish novelist who, before he was Europe's most popular novelist, he was one of the most popular poets in Europe as well. Then Lord Byron came along in the early 18-teens, kind of surpassed that popularity. So Scott decided to try his hand in fiction and had great success. Again, he published anonymously, in part because if the novel flopped, he didn't want to ruin his reputation as a poet. Waverly is a novel, as I mentioned, about the Jacobite uprising of 1745. Much of it is set in the Highlands, and so that an exotic setting, would have been an exotic setting at the time, still is to many people now, had great allure for people. There's also a couple of romantic subplots in the novel that attracted readers, but also it's not the first historical novel, but the first great historical novel. That is to say, it is about an historical event that people knew about. Some people, it was within the living memory of some people. This historical event helped shape the United Kingdom. And so that event, that subject matter, drew readers. But Scott was also popular because he wrote about historical change generally. All of his novels were about what you might call pivot moments in history, moments where great cultural and political moments are kind of collide and need to be sorted out. So there's always kind of this elegiac sense to his novels where you're waving goodbye to one time in history and moving on to another. And Scott does not say, his novels do not say times were better in the old days and we're worse off now. Some of his critics, including Mark Twain, used to complain about that, but that's a misreading of Scott. Scott says we're pretty good. We're pretty happy now. Things are good. Past times had many difficulties and hardships, but with all change comes some loss, and it's important to remember what we lose in progress along the way. So I think that those ideas were important to readers really around the world. When I say he was Europe's most popular novelist, we read Jane Austen much more now because her novels are more accessible, even though they're not easy. They're not absorbed in historical events the same way Scott's novels were. But in his lifetime and for much of the 19th century, Scott was the most popular novelist. Places around the world are named after Walter Scott or his characters, including right around here in Northern Virginia and D.C. and Maryland. So I think it's kind of important to discuss why he was so beloved and in true Scott fashion, consider what we're losing when we stop reading Scott. And if I can continue by saying very quickly, conservatives in particular have loved Walter Scott. Not only conservatives, many liberals in his time, his liberal contemporaries loved him as well. But great conservative figures like G.K. Chesterton, now St. John Henry Newman, Russell Kirk, praised Walter Scott. Kirk in particular said that Scott popularized and made accessible the theories that Edmund Burke presented in his important book, anti-revolutionary book, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Scott popularized those ideas in a way that Burke never would have been able to.
Two other facts about Walter Scott. There's a tribute to him at the Library of Congress.
Yes.
And Frederick Douglass, you write, chose his name from a Walter Scott poem.
Yeah, Walter Scott has a character, I think it's in Lady of the Lake, named Douglas. And Frederick Douglass picked that name after that. A friend suggested it. And Walter Scott is prominent in the Library of Congress. There's a bust of him in the front, and then another image of him in the foyer. The Library of Congress, as you know, one of the most beautiful buildings in D.C., and it has his presence there is pretty strong.
Christopher Scalia, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but you're talking about him being the most popular novelist in all of Europe and in his age. How popular was that? Was he anonymous on the streets? Was he widely read? I mean, are we talking 2,000 copies, 100 copies of his books? This is in the early 1800s.
I'm afraid I don't have numbers offhand, but he sold out quickly. And the second printings would come out very quickly. People guessed at his identity pretty quickly, in part because his poems dealt with the same kind of thing. Similar characters show up in his poems and fiction. Themes, elements of the supernatural show up in both. Jane Austen suspected, for example, that Walter Scott was the author of the Waverley novels. So people were onto the secret pretty quickly, but he didn't come out directly until the 1820s, when he had been at it for about 15 years, I think. But even then, he didn't, when he published a novel, didn't say by Sir Walter Scott. It said by the author of Waverley or some of his other works. Reading
at that time was for the elites, wasn't it? I mean,
not certainly people were more. Fewer people were literate then. I think it's not quite the elite, but yes, the fewer people were educated, so many fewer people could read. But the interesting thing about fiction then was the concern that it wouldn't be the elite reading it. Samuel Johnson expressed this fear, and many novelists expressed this fear later on, that fiction was so accessible that, to use the term, Johnson's term was something like the young, the indolent, and the young, the ignorant, and the idle would read fiction, not really thoughtful people. So that meant, for Johnson, that meant novelists had to be really careful about what they wrote about, because such impressionable readers would be encountering this fiction. The fiction had to be moral. It had to teach important lessons and couldn't present bad behavior in a positive light. Now, later novelists didn't share all of those concerns, but they did share the concern that novels could be dangerous and weren't taken seriously. Walter Scott, for example, in Waverly, one of the important subplots there is that the title character, Waverly, reads a lot, but he doesn't read good stuff, and he's not directed. He doesn't have good tutors or mentors guiding him in his reading. So he reads basically just chivalric romances that make him susceptible to being preyed upon by people trying to overthrow the government, which is why he ends up joining the Jacobite uprising. And so it is, to put it very simply, his bad education, in particular his reading of bad fiction, brought him to unfortunate decisions. So it's kind of an overstatement, but the point is clear, and it's a point that a lot of important novels make. Jane Austen makes a similar point in Northanger Abbey. It's a spoof of the young woman's obsession with Gothic literature. She sees Gothic terrors all around her, even though she's living in modern-day England. Don Quixote is about something similar, and arguably Frankenstein is as well. And if I can cap this point off with a modern-day lesson, one of the most popular trends in literature right now is a genre called romantasy. I don't write about this in my book because I'm only just now learning about it myself. It's romantasy is, as the title suggests, a combination of romance and fantasy. So a lot of sex, a lot of romance, but with fairies and elves, and a lot of dragon slaying and fighting evil. Doesn't sound like my cup of tea, but I was reading about it in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, and it's very popular among young women right now. And it's so popular that the fear is it's kind of disrupting or deforming their expectations of romance in the real world. And the journalist interviewed a therapist who said, I've spoken to people who come to me and they read so much romantasy, they're having trouble meeting men or having realistic expectations about the boyfriends they have now. So I've had to tell them to stop reading this kind of literature. So that is a bad example of how much literature, fiction in particular, can shape us, can form our expectations and what we think.
Are the Frances Burneys, the Walter Scotts, etc., accessible to the modern English tongue today?
It is a challenge, absolutely. I think the sentences are more elaborate, more complex in structure. They take longer to read than a novel from the present day would. But the wonderful thing about great fiction is that although the times and places are entirely unfamiliar to us and the characters and narrators speak in ways we would not, the people are still recognizable, the situations are still recognizable, the lessons are still understandable, if not directly applicable, indirectly applicable to our own lives. And I think I'm confident that anybody, and there are a lot of people who still read Jane Austen and celebrate her and other 19th century novelists. I think there's no reason they couldn't also enjoy these, the 19th century novels I write about here. I would especially recommend not only Frances Burney for anybody who loves Jane Austen. Novelists I don't include in there. Maria Edgeworth. She has a great novel called Belinda that I write about briefly in one of the appendixes to my book. And George Eliot, who I devote a chapter to, her novel Daniel Deronda. These are just remarkable novelists who have keen insights into human nature, and in those cases especially young women and love, romance.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Somebody who is not on the list, maybe you didn't consider him, Christopher Buckley, son of William F. Buckley, well-known novelist of our age.
I discuss him in the appendix to my book, Thank You for Smoking in particular. I think one of the reasons I didn't include him is I suspected conservatives who like reading fiction already know about Christopher Buckley. He and Tom Wolfe, I think, are two more. I should have mentioned Wolfe at the beginning of my pitch of the novel at the start of our conversation. Those are novelists that conservatives know and love already. But Buckley's great. He's a great satirist, and Thank You for Smoking is one of the great spoofs of DC. The closest thing I have to that is Evelyn Waugh's novel, Scoop.
1938.
What's the
story?
A send-up of journalism that is unfortunately all too relevant today. It's about a young man named Boot, who is William Boot, who is, through a case of mistaken identity, sent off to Africa to write about a political conflict there in a fictional nation called Ishmaelia. And while he's there, he learns a lot of things, but especially he learns about journalists and journalism. And what he discovers is not impressive. He finds that journalists go to their stories with a preset, what we now call narrative, and that they don't like correcting themselves, that there's a lot of groupthink involved. And I like to joke that this book is totally outdated. But I think anybody who reads this novel will enjoy it in large part because the complaints about journalism are so familiar. Now, conservatives aren't the only people who like complaining about journalism. So liberals have enjoyed this novel for as long as conservatives have. And whereas a lot of my books focus on kind of conservative ideas and principles, disliking journalists and being skeptical of journalism isn't so much a principle as a habit among conservatives right now. But I think it's a great novel. I know many journalists who love it, and in part because it's such an accurate send-up of that profession.
Well, Evelyn Waugh you describe as a conservative.
He is
a Christian and a traditionalist in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. He's one of the. I think conservatives already know about Waugh. I mentioned Brideshead Revisited earlier as one of the great Catholic novels of the 20th century, though people of really all sorts of religious beliefs are drawn to that novel. But Brideshead Revisited is funny because it's funny because it's not funny, or at least not as funny as so many of his other novels. Brideshead Revisited is atypical of Waugh because it is very sentimental, very misty-eyed, and I love it. But if you want characteristic Waugh, his sharper satires, I think, are better books to go to. Scoop is one of them. A Handful of Dust is another. That's probably my favorite Waugh novel. But yes, Waugh was he was a conservative. He was certainly a curmudgeon, and one recognized by people of all political beliefs, one of the great stylists of the 20th century. In my chapter on Scoop, I point out some of the similarities between what Waugh writes about and what George Orwell writes about, particularly the dangers of bad writing. This is not one of the central points of Scoop, but what you notice about these journalists and newspapers in general is that they're just lazy. They don't think about what they're writing, and there are dangerous consequences to that. And this is something that Orwell wrote about in one of the great, there's the groupthink and doublethink in his fiction, but also just the dangers of sloppy thinking and sloppy writing in his great essay, Politics in the English Language. So, and of course, Orwell was certainly not a conservative, so I think it's fascinating that there's that parallel between what he was saying and what Waugh says.
So you do not consider Orwell to be a conservative?
No, I mean he
conservatives love.
They love him, but they love him because he's anti-communist. But he was not. I don't think he was really a conservative. He recognized the dangers of totalitarian rule. Liberals love 1984 as much as conservatives do. They, during Trump's first term, liberals everywhere were recommending people read 1984 because it was an omen of the Trump administration. And conservatives do similar things when Democrat presidents who wield a lot of executive authority do the same thing.
Now, I know we're talking about 13 novels conservatives will love, but as somebody who has studied literature and received a PhD in it, what about Beowulf, Gulliver's Travels, Shakespeare? What are your thoughts about those?
I think people should read those.
What's your personal thoughts?
Well, I mean, I love all of those. I've enjoyed all of those, and I think if people want to have a great understanding of the Western literary tradition and great literature in general, they should be familiar with those things. And if they read them in high school or junior high or maybe even a college survey course, let's face it, we're all a little bit dumber in high school than college. And as we mature, we learn things. And I would recommend if people grew up hating Shakespeare that they go back and give Shakespeare another try, because I mentioned the wisdom of great literature. Shakespeare has so much great wisdom in there. One of the tips I give readers in this novel is to just kind of recognize that sometimes novelists are pretty transparent about the ideas they want you to think about in their novels. Walter Scott used the word desultory very often in his novel to describe Edward Waverley's education, to suggest this is and even Waverley's name, Waverley, suggests something unsteady, unmoored about Edward that leads to the trouble he gets himself into. And in Evelina, a keyword that shows up again and again is impertinent. Not a word we use very often, even if we know what it means now, because she's obsessed with rude, impolite people who don't understand social mores and manners. And so it is with Shakespeare. He's pretty obvious about what he wants you to be thinking about as you read his plays. It's kind of a bit of pattern recognition. When you read Shakespeare, you recognize how often in a play, for example, he mentions honor. And all sorts of characters describe honor in different terms, ascribe different meanings to that word. And I think, that may be something that goes over your head in high school, that you're more ready and able to recognize later on. I taught Gulliver's Travels very often in college, and a little bit I think I taught it when I was a TA in grad school as well. Students think they know that story because they've kind of heard the fairy tale versions of it, but they really just know the first book, when he goes to Lilliput and he's surrounded by very small people and he's a giant there. There are 3 other books that are equally memorable and fascinating. Swift also was pretty conservative. He was part of a circle called the Scriblarians that he and his peers, Alexander Pope was another one, loved to mock fashionable, trendy learning and impractical studies. So I think it's the 3rd book of Gulliver's Travel takes particular aim at that, and I think that's the kind of thing conservatives now who like to poke fun at, college majors like underwater basket weaving. That's the stupid major that doesn't exist, that conservatives like making fun of all the time for some reason. But if concerned about going to college and scholars studying things that actually matter, get a particular kick, I think, out of book 3 of Gulliver's Travels.
What novel are you currently reading?
I'm reading an Elmore Leonard novel. I don't write about Elmore Leonard in my book because he's technically not literary fiction. He writes crime or suspense fiction. Elmore Leonard started writing westerns in the early 1950s and wrote. When he started writing, he had a full-time job at advertising, but he woke up at like 5 a.m., wrote for a couple of hours, went off to work, snuck a little bit of writing when people weren't paying attention at the office. He did this for about 10 years, took a little break, came back to it, and moved away from westerns and started writing more contemporary crime fiction, and started gaining a lot of traction in the 80s. Everybody loved Elmore Leonard by the 80s. George Will loved him. Walker Percy loved him, to name a couple of people conservatives really like, but not just conservatives. Martin Amis, the great British novelist. So literary novelists loved him as well. Because he wrote crime fiction, but he wrote it so well. He was really influenced by Hemingway in particular, and Hemingway's dialogue. Elmore Leonard, you could tell he's not writing literary fiction because the way he put it, he says, don't write all the stuff readers skip. In other words, long paragraphs, long descriptions, the kind of thing that tired people don't have time for. Skip that. Get to the dialogue. People like dialogue. And he was a master of dialogue. It's something he learned from Hemingway. And master of double-cross plots and and things like that. So I'm in the middle of a novel called La Brava, which I think in 1983, and I've been reading a lot of his fiction this summer. It's easier than the other stuff I had been reading, and it's also I've just read a biography of him that kind of got me interested in his work. I should say a lot of his novels were turned into TV shows and movies. So Justified is a great TV show from FX from I think 2010 to 2016, based on one of his characters. And Get Shorty, a great movie from the 1990s. Out of Sight, another great movie from the 90s. And Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown. Those are all based on Elmore Leonard novels.
Did you grow up surrounded by books?
Yes. We talked about my father earlier, and my father was a huge influence in this book in that he really got me interested in ideas of conservatism. He recommended some of the conservative thinkers I discuss in my book, like Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley, just to name a couple, Chesterton, C.S. Lewis. But my mother is a great lover of fiction, and she made sure her children were all great lovers of fiction. She always got us novels for Christmas and our birthdays, and was always reading fiction herself. She majored in English at Radcliffe. That's where she met my father when he was in law school at Harvard. So her influence is really also at least as significant in this book as my father's influence is. So I always recognized that reading was important. My parents always encouraged it. And I grew up in a house where fiction was, we took fiction seriously. Novels weren't just, they could be a time to just, my mom didn't only read great literary fiction. She didn't only give us great literary fiction. She read thrillers herself too. But we also understood that great literature is capable of doing great things and shaping how we think. I should add that one of the novels I write about here, Enger's Peace Like a River from 2001, when that novel first came out, my mom recommended it to me. At least two of my siblings recommended it to me. And I never got around to reading it. A colleague of mine at UVA, Wise, recommended it to me. But I only finally got around to reading it when I started working on this book. I read dozens of books as research for this book. And Peace Like a River was one of them. And I was so mad that I hadn't read it when my family members told me to. And in part because I had to tell them, you were right. And nobody wants to say that to anybody in one's family. So I had to eat crow there, but I'm glad they recommended it.
With regard to that book, here are my verbatim notes on Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. 9/11/2001 publication date, embrace of classic Americana, redemption, miracles, Christian, prayer, good versus evil, and gratitude.
Yes, I have no idea what Enger's politics are, but and I should also add, not many people have read this novel, but I've never met anybody who read this novel who did not love it. It's uncanny. But again, Enger's, I don't know what his politics are, but I think conservatives will love this novel because it's a wonderful depiction of a close family. And it is a great examination of good and evil and the shades of gray in between. Very briefly, it's a novel about this family, one of whose the Land family. There are three children in the family. The oldest brother, Davy, I believe his name is, commits a crime, and he's apprehended, but he escapes and he goes on the lam. And the authorities chase him. His family members, his father Jeremiah, his little brother, whose name is eluding me, who's also the narrator, and then this little sister Swede, who I think is the best character in the novel, they go out searching for him. And Davy is a deeply flawed character. He has a sense of justice. The crime he committed is an act of retribution against clearly more sinister people who seek to harm his family. But we recognize, along with the narrator, that Davy is a deeply flawed character. Jeremiah, on the other hand, is he's a remarkable character. He has a great sense of justice. In my chapter and in a recent piece in National Review, I argue that he's kind of this ideal of masculine behavior, because he's capable of being aggressive, of acting out, being impulsive, but he's also calm. He's also capable of working within the law and understand. He's a man of great faith and a man of great justice. And then there's the final character, who shows up fairly late in the novel, who's this ultimate emblem of evil, and a particularly masculine type of evil that abuses women, recognizes no authority above himself, and is much worse than the son. But the son is obviously a terribly flawed character himself. So I think and to a large degree, it's a Western novel. And Westerns are so great. It's set in the 1960s, but readers will recognize this clear Western element as these outlaws try to avoid the law and other people try to bring them back in. There are horses, there are hideouts, all sorts of shootouts, all sorts of Western elements like that. So in my chapter, I compare it to Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy is a novelist a lot of people like. Conservatives love him. They see him as especially insightful about human nature and recognizing the evils inherent within human nature. They recognize Christian elements to his novels, especially his kind of references to and the debt he owes to the King James Bible. But I didn't cover McCarthy in part because I don't like him as much. I recognize his importance, but I don't like him as much as a lot of other people do, so I would have felt phony. But I think Enger is worth considering in parallel to McCarthy, because he deals with so many of the same things, but is a little bit more, he's much more optimistic, I would say, than McCarthy is. He's more, I haven't said an important element of Peace Like a River yet, which is that the father, Jeremiah, is, at least the narrator thinks, capable of performing miracles. And so it's a novel that considers the role that faith plays in our lives, and it really forces you to consider, and Christian readers in particular, to consider, well, if you believe in miracles, what does that mean for the everyday? And if you witnessed a miracle today with somebody you knew wasn't perfect, what would that mean for your faith and your understanding?
Are you a novelist?
I have tried writing a novel, but I am not a novelist. I've written some fiction, I've written some poetry, but I think I'm better off writing other things.
From your book, any artist who elevates his political point above the techniques and elements of his craft is creating propaganda, not art.
Yes. And I quote all sorts of smarter people who say the same thing. And the point isn't that novels can't engage with ideas. Of course they can. That's really what great ideas do. But novels that endure, that transcend generations and political beliefs, can make a point, or as to quote Emily Dickinson, her point about poetry, tell the truth but tell it slant. Be subtle with the ideas you're depicting, and recognize the counters and the shortcomings and the complexities of those ideas. I think fiction that isn't capable of doing that can be pretty boring, and cardboard cutout type characters are kind of. That's why I think that's one of Rand's great shortcomings. Her novels can be exciting, and they have memorable characters, but the characters tend to be relatively stereotypical and predictable in a way that I think better novelists avoid.
And once again, here are the 13 novels that Christopher Scalia says that conservatives will love but probably haven't read. Samuel Johnson, Rasselas, which came out in 1759. Frances Burney's Evelina. Walter Scott, Waverley. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Blithedale Romance. George Eliot, Daniel Deronda. Willa Cather, My Antonia, 1918. Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Evelyn Waugh, Scoop. Muriel Sparks, The Girls of Slender Means, V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River, which came out in 1979, P.D. James, The Children of Men, Leif Enger, Peace Like a River, which came out in 2001, and Christopher Baha, am I saying that right?
I think it's Beha.
Beha.
But I'm not sure.
The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, which came out in 2020. Our guest has been the author of this book, 13 novels conservatives will love but probably haven't read. Christopher Scalia, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for joining us for this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, rate and review us and tell your friends. And next week on this podcast, our guest is Jill Doherty, longtime Moscow bureau chief for CNN. She's out with a new book entitled My Russia.